Despite a field full of stars, champions, and the best last week, we saw Harris English emerge victorious in a playoff with Joaquin Niemann. Hopefully you were in on him. I mentioned him as one of my favorite betting picks of the week based on my win simulation model. Can he repeat out in Hawaii, or is YLA a very different setup than Kapalua, what they had last week, despite being out in Hawaii? We'll dig into all that and more. Welcome on in to the FanDuel PGA Q&A for this week's PGA Tour event, the Sony Open out in Hawaii. I'm your host, Brandon Gdula. I'm the managing editor over at numberFire.com, and I will be breaking down this event, the course at YLA Country Club, looking at the best betting odds on FanDuel Sportsbook, some of the best values on FanDuel for daily fantasy purposes, checking out some of my favorite golfers based on really my win simulation model for this week. Unlike last week, we do have a cut for the top 65 scores and ties after 2 rounds. The field is not 40-ish golfers, but rather 140 or so. So it is a bit different of a setup. And what's it going to take to win this week? Who has the right stats? We will get there. But first, if you have any questions about this week's field, hit up the YouTube chat, and I will do my best to answer those questions the best I can. But let's start by taking a look at the field over at FanDuel Sportsbook, looking at the favorites. Webb Simpson, 13-1. Colin Morikawa, 14-1. Daniel Berger, Harris English, both 16-1. Sungjae Im's 18-1 here. Always plays well on Bermuda, or plays his best on Bermuda, I should say. Hideki Matsuyama, Joaquin Niemann, both 22-1. Niemann almost got it done last week, went into a playoff, actually had a nice rest in between his round and the playoff with Harris English. Cam Smith, last year's winner here, 28-1, obviously showed up at Augusta. What's his form like? We can get into that if you're interested. Kevin Kisner, also 28-1. So again, not the best of the best field, but those are some names who we should be very, very familiar with. So Webb Simpson, the favorite. Does that make sense? Does the course fit him? Let's take a look. Let's head over to Data Golf and look at how this course shapes up. Again, Cam Smith won last year, 11 under par. I always like to look and see where the winners are when they do win. 11 under implies that it's a tougher course, but if we dig back farther into history, we see Matt Kuchar, 22 under. Patton Kizzire, 17 under. Justin Thomas, 27 under. Fabian Gomez, 20 under. So this is pretty much an easy course. What happened last year was it was very, very, very windy. The favorite in this field was Justin Thomas. He actually missed the cut, which is something that can definitely happen in golf. I believe he actually was pretty terrible with the putter, but was good tee to green. Yeah, one of the worst putting performances. Very good tee to green. It was a very windy event. That's kind of Cam Smith's game. Great short game for him. That's kind of something that we can see. Now, thankfully, weather is not that big of a factor for this week. We can kind of neglect it. It's always okay to look at weather, try to dig into some wind splits. But I think for this week, we can play it pretty much straight up. I always like this page on Data Golf because I can look at how this event plays relative to the tour average in terms of which of the strokes gained stats are driving variation in score. Basically, what is accounting for the differentiation in the score in a given week. If we look here, putting at this event on average explains about 38.6% of the scoring differentiation. That's higher than the average number on the PGA Tour. And we also see strokes gained approach a little bit lower at 32.3% than 34.7% for the PGA Tour average. However, what this means is still strokes gained approach is combined the most important tee to green stat. If you add up strokes gained off the tee and strokes gained around the green, it's 29.2%. Again, you can see here, strokes gained approach, 32.3%. So you can never really downplay approach. Some weeks it's maybe a little bit less important, but it's always going to be the most important stat, tee to green, week in and week out. Is it a distance or accuracy course? Data Golf has that as well. We can look here at this radar plot and see that it is trending more toward accuracy than it is toward distance. again, I think that sometimes we can get in our head that similar locations, again, both events out in Hawaii can be somewhat similar, but Kapalua is actually very, very different than what we're getting this week at YLA. You can see the blue here shows that driving distance was very important last week. Not quite so important to be accurate off the tee. This week, we can see in the green, it's kind of the inverse of that. So this means that really nobody in the field is disqualified for being a short hitter, but accuracy alone is not enough. It's not a key enough ingredient. You don't just want to list, you don't want to roster the most accurate golfers. It's not going to get it done. You need birdies, but this week, if you're a short hitter off the tee, you can still contend. Also, the easier the course is, the more golfers who can excel. These guys are the best in the world. You can separate on the field by birdieing a par 4 if the course is playing tough and that par 4 is playing over par. But whenever everyone kind of can birdie a par 4, you don't just automatically, you're not in contention for equals just because you're the class of the field. So to me, every time a course can play easy, I do worry a little bit. It does get a little more open, and we can see that in the betting odds too, being a little bit flatter. So keep that in mind. Now, quickly, I just want to jump over here to the most similar courses to YLA. Harbortown pops as the most similar course in terms of which key stats matter the most. It's pretty relevant because Webb Simpson usually does well at Harbortown, just won there in June. Other top golfers at Harbortown, some of these names, Matt Kuchar, Jim Furyk, Rory Sabatini, Kevin Na, Russell Knox. I'm not particularly into any of those guys outside of Webb for this week, but, those are some golfers who kind of fit the course well enough. But just be careful trying to play the corollary angle because Matt Kuchar, we know, is not in the same form that he has been in years past when he has done well at, Harbortown, at YLA, for example. So for me, it's mostly about recent form, recent stats. The key stats for me this week, based on everything I'm seeing, strokes gained approach, number 1. It's always number 1. It's pretty much always going to be number 1. Driving accuracy is on the list. It's high up the list because we can see golfers who aren't long but who are accurate can get a leg up. Strokes gained putting, specifically on Bermuda greens, if you have access to that. Birdie or better rate. And actually, strokes gained around the green is just kind of weirdly more important here than usual, but we also know that it's not necessarily the most important number that we can dig into. It's really sort of always an ancillary, tertiary stat to dig into. You don't want to be making your decisions based on who has the best around the green game. Let's hop over to my spreadsheets here and look at the field top to bottom. I think it's a really interesting field. I think it's kind of anyone's event. We recall those winners. We can get winners from anywhere. The favorites aren't necessarily guaranteed to win. I would say we have a tier of about the top 7 or so this week, whether that's on FanDuel or just in the betting market. I think that those are the ones that we could key in on. So I'm going to do that and break down the studs, because whether you're looking for a bet or you're playing on FanDuel, you do want some studs to anchor your lineups. You want probably one of these studs to be at the top of your betting card. Obviously, feel free to go longer. I'm always in favor of that, but some of my favorite bets actually do come from this top 7 range. We see his long-term total adjusted strokes gained data of 2020, according to datagolf.com. 99th percentile in this field. Really no flaws here. I do actually have literal red flags for guys who rate out in the 25th percentile or worse in any of these stats that I like to look at for this particular course. Not a whole lot of those, out of the entire 7 guys here. We see it with Hideki as a putter, both overall and on Bermuda. We see it with Joaquin Niemann on Bermuda, and then Colin Morikawa on Bermuda as well. Those stats, the Bermuda stats, are over the past 100 rounds. They come from fantasynational.com. They are bottom tier players, bottom tier putters on Bermuda greens. So you do have to nitpick this week. And for that reason, you can kind of see that, if you're watching this video closely, you can see that I do have 4 names highlighted in green: Webb Simpson, Harris English, Daniel Berger, Sungjae Im. They are, to me, the best daily fantasy plays of the week. However, my research has shown that the betting favorite and the highest salary golfer is pretty much always locked in to being the most popular golfer. So let's say Webb Simpson is on 45, even 40% of lineups. You can make a case to fade Webb Simpson in daily fantasy, even though he is the most likely golfer to win based on my win simulations. Fits the course really well. Anytime you look at his profile, he does everything well. Look at all these green marks. The only thing he doesn't do well is hit it long, and you don't have to do that this week. It comps well. This course comps well to Harbortown. We know Webb generally succeeds at Harbortown, so there are a lot of reasons to like Webb, but we do have other pivots. And if I'm pivoting first and foremost, I'm going to look to Sungjae Im or Daniel Berger. Very similar win odds, very similar salaries. My win simulations do prefer Daniel Berger. You can also see that they actually prefer Harris English to even Daniel Berger, but my win simulations do not account for the fact that Harris English played to the high end of his potential last week. I just like to see long-term data, simulate this thing out 10,000 times based on how these guys play, what their strengths are, and see what should happen more often than not. I actually like to think of this specific event a year ago. When you build a golf betting model, it's not necessarily to pinpoint a singular golfer who is going to win. You would not have wanted your model last year to say Cam Smith was going to win, specifically with Justin Thomas in that field. We know if we play that thing out 100 times, 1,000 times, Cam Smith is not going to win it more frequently than Justin Thomas. All I like to see with my betting model is who wins this thing more frequently than their betting odds imply. That has been good for me in the past. We saw Harris English last week as the best expected value. The event before, I didn't do a stream for it. Last week was my first, but Victor Hovland, the best expected value. I don't say that as a brag by any means. What that really means is I'm probably not going to hit a winner for a few weeks, but what this goes to show is trusting the long-term form rather than chasing what happened last week, the week before, really digging into these small samples. Trust the long-form data, and you will have success in the long run, especially if you are putting at the forefront things like strokes gained approach, strokes gained off the tee, and not chasing guys who are really buoyed by their short game. So again, my favorite daily fantasy plays from a process standpoint are Webb Simpson, Sungjae Im, Daniel Berger. I'm fine pivoting to Colin Morikawa in a tournament. I think Joaquin Niemann even makes sense. You can see here that he's not the most accurate golfer, but this is the thing with driving accuracy. It doesn't necessarily do a good job of accounting for which fairways were hit, which fairways were missed, whether guys even cared about hitting a particular fairway. Sometimes golfers want to miss in the right spots, and that might not be on the fairway. Also, golfers can club down at this level, hit a fairway if they need to. Not all of them do it all the time, but just keep in mind, whenever it's a course where accuracy matters, you can succeed without driving accuracy alone. So again, I like Webb on DFS, on FanDuel. I like Sungjae. I like Daniel Berger. I'm okay pivoting. If I had to bet one of these guys, I would go with Daniel Berger. He popped in my model last week just behind Harris English. It's the same case this week. I bet both of them last week. I had English work out. I like to stick with these guys who continuously seem a little bit undervalued. We saw that in the fall. Someone, for example, Bryson at the US Open, his odds fell just because of a little bit of poor recent form, but we know long-term what his potential really was. So again, that's the way that I like to view things. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to hit up the YouTube chat, and I will answer those gladly. Let's stick with like the FanDuel angle here, and look at the sort of mid range. Let's do not the super studs, and see who stands out here in this second range. I highlighted two names here, Kevin Kisner and Russell Henley. What gets me on them? Actually, I'll just filter this so it's easier to focus on these two. The iron play for them long term has been very good. Again, these numbers come from Data Golf. They are adjusted for field strength. They're from the start of 2020. I like a long-term sample. It is generally more predictive than looking back, 4 weeks. Sometimes, it's a lot of fun to look at who's golfing the best over the past 12, 24 rounds. Even 50 rounds can be misleading if it's not properly adjusted for field strength, or performance leading in even. So I like to use lean on Data Golf here for the majority of the strokes gain data that I use. We see Russell Henley the best. He's in the 100th percentile in this field in strokes gained approach. Kevin Kisner, 84th percentile. And these are two golfers who can gain strokes off the tee. You can see here, Kisner's in the 72nd percentile, Henley 61st. But what they do well is hit fairways. They're not long. Despite that, they are pretty solid at gaining strokes off the tee. And frankly, if you dig into and try to predict strokes gained off the tee, the majority of it does come from driving distance, not just from hitting fairways. So they are doing well to gain strokes despite not being long. They do it through hitting fairways and being, somewhat long enough to be in contention. So I like these two names, Kevin Kisner, Russell Henley, in the mid-range for FanDuel. I'm actually just going to stick here with a few more names because I do think this week on FanDuel, a balanced lineup makes a lot of sense. Building around maybe one of the studs, one of those top 7 I mentioned. Again, pretty much anyone but Hideki in that top range I feel good about. But Kisner, Henley, both above 10,000, but below that in terms of salary, we have Zach Johnson at 9,900, Brendan Todd, Sebastian Munoz, 97, Jason Kokrak, 93 there. But you can see really good long-term adjusted strokes gain total, which means that they're just playing well relative to expectation. Not necessarily, it's a mixed bag in terms of the off-the-tee play, but generally good iron play, good approach numbers. For the solid enough Bermuda putting, I don't actually have anyone here highlighted in green who is a red flag in Bermuda putting. I do value that more than I used to. Putting is very volatile, but it is not necessarily completely random by any means. Golfers who are, golfers who at their best perform at like a field level baseline are going to have a really hard time to win. We have seen Justin Thomas, for example, win with, neutral strokes gain putting, but overall you need to gain 5, 6, maybe 7 plus strokes from putting unless you are by far the best tee to green golfer in a given week. So I think a lot of these names are very, very intriguing this week. I would be fine, honestly, betting outright on any of them, especially, from Taylor Gooch up, honestly. I think Gooch is interesting for sure. That's why he's highlighted. That's pretty obvious, but he is one of the better fits, I think, for this particular course. We can zoom in here a little bit. No red flags for him. So he's in the 26th percentile or better in all of the key stats. You can see he's actually, I guess the lowest is 45th percentile in fairways gained, which, yes, is one of the key stats, but he is not particularly poor in that number. Field average is fine for the purposes of what we're looking for this week. Bermuda putting as well, but good, pretty solid, long-term putting, long-term approach, good at making birdies. So I think he's one of the more intriguing plays, both on FanDuel and as an outright bet at 70-1 on FanDuel Sportsbook. Matthew Neesmith, someone reached out for the Heat Check podcast that Jim Sonis and I do, and said that Neesmith was going to win. I like that call. I don't think it's completely random by any means. I think Neesmith again is a good value. Let me filter him out here. What we see here is, yes, there's a red flag around the green. It's important, but it is not the most vital stat ever. What's more important is the strokes gained approach number. He rates out very well there. He rates out as a very good Bermuda putter. Whenever you're looking for long shots, you're never going to get a flawless player. There are some golfers who are generally long shots, someone like a Sebastian Munoz, even like a Lonto Griffin. They are very balanced, and there's a lot of value in having a balanced golfer. But generally, a long shot is someone who does have. I'm looking at the red flag. I'm going to say red flags, but who can do things on the high end that really put them in a good spot. The best outcome for Neesmith is that he's one of the best iron players and one of the best Bermuda putters in the field. If he does that, he can contend at a field like this whenever scores can go low. He can make birdies, very nice, 69th percentile birdie or better rate for him. So I think that this is a week where we have a lot of value options overall on FanDuel. I would recommend, when I'm building my lineups, I'm not going to go below 9,000, I think, for multiple golfers in a lineup, 8,000 range who are appealing. Henrik Norlander is one of them. That good ball striking, not great short game necessarily. That is a little bit of an issue. Above him, we have James Hahn. We have Mackenzie Hughes, who's always carried by his putter, but Tom Hoge is the name I would focus in on most for me this week. Pretty solid across the board. Very good iron player. Good enough off the tee. Accurate enough. And then we see him 35th percentile in Bermuda putting, which definitely not great. So that is it's a good enough recipe for Hoge at 8,900 on FanDuel, 90-1 to win outright. I do have a question from vicehood.com. Do I ever consider course history, even if only a small sample? I do consider course history sometimes. The way that I view course history is that it's never a bad thing to be successful at a particular course. But one of the biggest flaws of course history is we are not very good at looking at how a golfer is performing entering a specific event. So a win at a particular course is it can be because he was on a hot streak and that was his peak. Someone with a really long career, someone like a Matt Kuchar. If you look at his course history, how was he golfing at the time he fared well, right? And unless you're accounting for that, it can be really difficult to look at course history and say, this is predictive. Now, if you've ever played golf, courses both fit your eye, you can feel more comfortable there. I think that it's not completely irrelevant, but from all the research I've done, research I've read, course history is not the most predictive factor. It's a piece of the puzzle, I would say, between current form and coordinating those two. It's always about 80-20 in terms of current form versus course history. About even 20% might be a little bit more. When I build out my model, I don't actually account for some really good work on whether course history is predictive. I think that sometimes we can get just a little bit ahead of ourselves and feel a little overconfident, but it's a great question. It's a key piece to the puzzle. And then, while we're on course history, how do you define course history, right? Because Daniel Berger is someone who you would probably say from his finishes is not the right. He doesn't necessarily have great form. 38th last year, 14th before that, 45th, 42nd, 13th. So no top 10s, 2 top 15s, but also 3 finishes out of the 5 outside the top 35, right? But if you look on Fantasy National at his strokes gained tee to green numbers at the Sony Open, gaining 5.3, gaining 5, 3.4, 4.2, 11.6, just has not been a good putter. Now, what does that mean? It means to me that he's actually played the course really well, but that he just had bad putting regression or bad putting luck. Because if we look at Berger long term, he's actually a good Bermuda putter. I have him in the 76th percentile over a 100 round sample. So what that part of the reason I like Daniel Berger as one of my favorite bets of the week is great form, great current stats, and also surprisingly good form at the Sony Open, despite some finishes that aren't particularly. Sorry, I got another question. I got a little distracted. Does course history then come into consideration when it's a larger sample? For example, Charles Howell this week. Charles Howell is someone we talked about on Jim Sonis and I talked about Charles Howell specifically on the Heat Check podcast in the current form section. He has 10 top 10s in 19 career events, according to Jim's research. I'm just, coming right from Jim here. 12th last year, was 8th both in 2019 and 2017. So let's look at Howell real quick and see a few things, from Fantasy National. This is a great resource. You can do similar research on Data Golf. And if you look at their performance table, you can see similar things here. See adjusted, recent strokes gained at particular courses, but it's easier to filter on the fly here with Fantasy National. And so we look at all of these great finishes. The way that he's doing it, great tee to green numbers overall, very, very good putting. When you see this much green, that says he's, got a Jim knows I'm stealing his notes. But when you see so much green in the putting, you say, has he been extraordinarily lucky putting on these greens, or is he very comfortable? It's honestly probably both. But one thing to, I think the most important piece to course history is that recent form leading in. So the current form leading in terms of tee to green is a negative for him over the past 5 and past 10 events. It was a little bit better over the past 10 leading in last year. Again, 10 events leading in 2019 was better tee to green than he is now. About the same, but actually very, very poor in 5 events leading in. So I would say Charles Howell is not someone I like from a recent form standpoint, but who does kind of buck that trend, who is clearly not someone in great form currently. This is a better example too of what I'm looking at for 2017. Was in better form tee to green than he is now. So what wins out, current form or course history? I think it's a little bit of both. But for me overall, it's still about an 80-20 split. We have seen golfers come out of nowhere at courses where they're not specifically golfing very well, but they're comfortable with the course. In my research, more often than not, course history is overinflated. It's not that predictive. And so I prefer current form first and foremost. And I pretty much always will. So I'm running out of time, but I just want to reiterate a few things. This week, accuracy is a big bonus. Distance is not a requirement, so that puts someone like a Webb Simpson in a really good situation for this week. But at the top of the betting card, my win model likes Harris English again, but I have a hard time betting anyone to go back to back. So I'm going to go with Daniel Berger as one of my favorite bets at the top. I'm going to stick with him. I also like Sungjae Im. That was Jim's pick this week. Can't really go wrong. He plays really well on Bermuda. I think if you're looking for some long shots, Taylor Gooch stands out. Matthew Neesmith as well. And I think that any guys in this middle range who I have highlighted is Zach Johnson, who's played really well recently. Former winner here, Brendan Todd, Sebastian Munoz. These are guys I would consider for top tens. A more balanced betting card, but I think it's a really good week, even without some of the best names in the field. I think it's going to be a good event, and we saw last week. Even if it comes down to some names that we weren't necessarily considering, it can still be a really good event. That is all I have for today. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter at Gdula13, GDULA13. Check out my DFS content on numberFire, the Heat Check fantasy podcast, where we do talk every week about some of the guys with the best course history and how we're handling them specifically. But best of luck this week, and let's hit a winner.